All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Chi Johnson, and I'm a marketing specialist at Intellum. Our team of award-winning customer education professionals help the largest and fastest moving brands in the world successfully educate their customers, partners, and employees. We are the disruptors, the innovators, the creators, and the doers. And for 20 years, we have been observing and rethinking how people learn and collaborate. Customer education is a practical solution to a lot of issues organizations face with retention, revenue, and achieving crucial business outcomes. It can often feel complicated, but Intellum is here to help. This webinar series underscore is our way of providing more insight into what customer education is and can be. We prop up our experts to share the knowledge and practical advice right here inside the Intellum platform. Today, we're presenting how to ensure your education program is truly accessible. The most effective customer education programs consider learners of all types. The reality is prioritizing accessibility usually improves usability for all, with or without a disability. Assessing, that's the word I'm looking for, assessing digital accessibility, say that 10 times fast. This includes guidelines for people with vision, hearing, mobility, and cognitive disabilities. Today, we'll address why your program should be evaluated for accessibility and walk through how to deliver a more inclusive program. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so feel free to pop your questions in the chat panel throughout the webinar as they come to you. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's featured speaker. Tim Bland, Manager of Front-End Engineering, is based out of San Francisco, California. Tim has been with Intellum since December of 2016 and is considered our in-house accessibility guru. He's constantly thinking beyond front-end development and serves as an excellent partner to our product and design teams. His tenure and knowledge are indispensable to Intellum's success, and he's got a world of knowledge to share with you all today. So with that said, the virtual stage is all of yours, Tim.
All right, thank you, Chi. Okay, so just kind of set up some expectations. I don't consider myself an expert in accessibility. I'm someone who's become very interested in it, and I'm a very, very strong advocate for it. So accessibility can be big and complex. I'm still learning about it, and I think there's always room for everyone to learn more about it. The more we all know, the better. And what I go through here, I'm not planning on getting into very much into technicalities. I want to mainly talk about, what you need to think about to consider accessibility and how that affects how you consider your program design and content. All right, so just what is accessibility? One definition is it's the practice of creating products that are usable by people with the widest possible range of abilities operating within the widest possible range of situations. And that's a really good definition because it's not about thinking of disabilities or anyone who is hindered. It's about thinking that people use the internet in different ways and need to use devices in different ways, and all the ways you can make sure everyone is getting your content. So to think about that, next slide. So the question that might be on your mind is, why should my education program be accessible? There are a few possible answers to that. It might be a marketing question, and for example, can accessibility help me with SEO? Actually, it can. A lot of accessibility practices are also good for SEO. You have to consider, are your users asking for it? But a big one might be legal. Is this a legal requirement? What legally do you need to do to be accessible? Let's talk about that for a minute. What is legally required is not absolutely clear, but it is clear that it matters. It has become clear in various cases and courts that it matters. And the legal community and the accessibility community has come to kind of settle on what those guidelines are. What drives a lot of this is in the United States, at least, is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that prohibits discrimination based on disability. And that's in this case, it's two parts. It's, what's called a public accommodation. If you make something available to the public, has to be available to all the public. But also it does include providing reasonable accommodations to employees. So in the case of education content, if it's, especially employee oriented, you need to make sure that everyone can access it. But how companies can comply with the ADA has never been clearly established by any court cases or by government. What had become the de facto guidelines for this is what is called the WCAG, which is short for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And that's in multiple levels, and the levels that are considered the guidelines for legal accessibility are levels A and level AA. There's also a AAA level, but that is very intricate and as of yet isn't considered a requirement, though there might be certain industries and certain situations that require that. But for now, it's levels A and AA. And this was established, these were established by what's called the W3C, which is an international group about web standards. And generally, courts and advocates in the court have accepted these guidelines as what you need. The Department of Justice of the United States is expected to adopt these standards as the legal ones, but that's been in the works for years. So we don't really know when or if they will enforce that. But it's the best thing there is to work with. So it's a really good starting point. So then where do you start? The best thing to do is just become familiar with all the possibilities that accessibility covers. A lot of people, the first thing they go to is, oh, we have to put things in text form for screen readers for blind people. That's a big one, but it's not the only one. There's lots of other things. And a way to think about this is what's abbreviated as POUR, P-O-U-R. And that stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. These are the principles that your content should meet to really be accessible to everyone. Everyone needs to be able to see it. Everyone needs to be able to use it. Everyone needs to be able to understand it. And it has to be flexible enough that all kinds of technologies and possibilities get the same content. So that's a general way to look at it, but then it leads to the question, well, I think it's really helpful to think, what are the possible needs, different needs and abilities that we have to think about? And those fall into a lot of categories, a broadly physical category, and that includes, sensory input and output, vision and hearing particularly. But it also includes motor skills. It's like how can they and how can people and how do people actually use the internet? We tend to think of people are clicking around on a mouse. Maybe we're thinking more people are tapping on a screen, but there are other ways. Keyboard's super important. Keyboard use is very important for many people. So there's that. There's cognitive abilities to think about, and we'll talk about those in more detail later. And another aspect of accessibility that isn't often considered, but it really is part of it, is language. What language is the user using or likely to need? So let's, and more, there's more beyond that to think about. Need to think about what device they're using. Are they mobile? Are they on desktop? How big is their screen? Internet and device speed. We tend to work, a lot of us tend to work in environments where we have high-speed internet, and we tend to base all of our decisions on that. But some people don't and can't, because of location or just their, home or work circumstances. So those are other things to think about. But let's go back to physical. Physical, that, as I mentioned, this means sensory and motor input. Okay. And those, we can break that down into even more categories. A big one, as I mentioned, that comes to mind first is visual. Visual, you need to account for a range of abilities. We're not just talking about anyone who's completely blind. We're also talking about people with color blindness. We're talking about people who just don't see well or who may have other particular visual conditions. But again, a big one is the people who depend on screen readers, which read the content of the screen out loud for them to hear. So, and that means that you have to make sure that content and instructions for using the page get read to them, but also you have to make sure that it's not repetitious or intrusive. You got to make sure to say everything once, but not necessarily more than once. And that can make it complex, but when you get into the habit of it, it's much easier to understand that. And as for people who have issues with color contrast is super important. Even if they're not actually colorblind, the contrast of, say, buttons on the background or text on the background makes a big difference in how well they can actually understand the content. Another thing you have to think of is if you want to, there's a tendency, and I think it's a growing trend, to want to put information, even text, into images. There are reasons to do that, but the truth is that may not be the best way to get it to everyone. There's a very minimal way around that called alternative text. When you put an image in HTML, you can provide alternative text for whoever can't see it for whatever reason. They can't see, or it's just not loading anything. But before that, you might just consider, if this message is so important, is an image the best way to convey it? Should we not just make sure it's available in text somehow? And along those lines, when you're depicting something graphically, don't just depend on just color or just size or just shape. And we have, well, we'll show you some examples of that in a moment. But so visual, lots of things to consider. Auditory, that's going to come up mostly with the use of video and audio. And what do you do for people who don't or can't get the audio part of the content? So there are options with including captions and transcripts and some what's called alternative description, just at least say what content this would be or what information it conveys. And that's difficult and can be challenging, and it depends a lot on the tools you're using and your need to use. We very much wanted to be able to live caption this talk, for example, but the reality is conferencing tools are still learning how to provide that. And some do and some don't, and there are various ways to do it and various amounts of accuracy. So that's still developing, but it's a good thing to keep looking at. And then motor skills. A big way to fulfill that is to make sure that your site can be read and navigated and used with just a keyboard. No mouse, no tapping, just a keyboard. That means users can tab between buttons and links, can tab around the page to do any interaction they need to do. And it also means that when they do a new thing, when they're working with, say, a new form, that right off the bat, the place they need to start is where the focus lands. And the great thing about that is, even if you do use a mouse or do use a trackpad or whatever, the keyboard shortcuts are kind of cool. So it really, really helps everybody. So let's go back to as an example, let's go back to talking about color. This is just a good example of how you need to think about things a little more broadly and a little differently. So here we have a graph that shows various categories, and it's using only color to mark the categories. There's a key that tells you what color means what. Seems straightforward enough. But on the right side, this might be what it looks like to someone who has a particular kind of color blindness. And you can see suddenly we've lost 2 categories. There's only really 4 visible categories, but there are 6 things in the key. So it's not helpful. The simple way to fix that is to add another cue. Don't just depend on color. You go ahead and label these chunks. This clears up for it. We've clarified there are definitely 6 categories. We mark what they all are. There may be a little bit of repetition because the legend is there too, but that's fine. It's going to be clear to everyone. For this image, we would add information that makes textual information that conveys the same thing to non-sighted users. So everyone gets the information. Nobody misses out. Okay. So that covers very broadly a lot of the needs for a lot of the physical needs. So the next thing to talk about is cognition. This is a wide range of things, talking about how the mind receives and processes information, how your content actually reaches a wide range of people. Here are things to think about. For example, there's comprehension abilities, developmental disabilities, a whole range of things that are classified as autism, dyslexia, Alzheimer's. Even something as simple as sleep deprivation may be something you have to take into account. What we're talking about, just very simply, is you need to accommodate a wide range of cognitive skills that affect attention and memory. So how do you do that? A lot of this, again, these are things that would help your content overall for everyone. Use consistent, clear structure and navigation. That means, use a consistent outline structure for text content and a consistent use of headings to separate the content. For navigation, make sure you use a standard menu design and make sure you have consistent placement so that everybody, no matter what page they're on, knows where to expect to know how to get around. And make your content easy to understand. Consider that people, they have a variety of attention they can pay to your content right then, or that they, for whatever reason, need it, make it understandable to everyone as best you can, which is, great for education, period. Avoiding disruptive visuals. That covers like, don't have jarring animation, like don't have suddenly something come into place quickly in the middle of the page after they've gotten there. It also covers in video, you need to really be aware of avoiding flickering or flashing because that can actually trigger seizures in some people. You have to, quick cutting is fine, but make sure it's reasonable, make sure it's within a range that isn't going to disrupt anyone. And a way to help with that is let users control the animation and the video. Content shouldn't change unexpectedly while they're looking at a page. Yes, that includes pop-ups that if you use pop-ups, they should always be something that the user does that causes them. The user should expect it. They shouldn't just pop out of nowhere. This is something a lot of people don't cover. There are so many newsletter pop-ups on pages, and really, that's not helpful to a lot of people. It's annoying for some, including me, but for some people, it's really disruptive. It may break their concentration. It may be an actual problem in their learning. So don't. And if you want to use video, video's great, but don't depend on autoplay. Don't force autoplay. Avoid it. If you do feel a strong need to use it, if you find it helpful, then provide controls so that anyone can stop it or replay it or look at the video on their own time. So that covers a lot of the things you need to think about cognition. And that brings us to language, which, like I mentioned, that one isn't thought of a lot, but it is accessibility. You're not reaching everyone if they can't understand your content because it's not in their language. I mean, the first basic thing is just consider that all your users may not speak your language. Now, it's not necessarily feasible for you to put everything on your website in every language possible. That's unreasonable. That doesn't make sense. But but consider who your audience is likely to be and make sure you're accommodating them. Sometimes also there might be legal requirements if you're doing work in or for government. You probably are, especially in Canada, a lot of content has to be in both English and French. So you hit right off the bat, you might have legal considerations that make you need to do that. But even if you don't think about it, don't necessarily assume your entire audience is speaking English. And if they aren't, think about whether you might need to accommodate them with another language. So by the way, at this point, we should mention that the Intellum platform, for example, does provide a lot of localization functionality built into the tool. The interface has been translated into 32 languages, and that's driven by whatever the learner has set as their language preference. If you want an example of that, if you go to the Facebook group blueprint page, if you go down to the bottom of the page, you can change the language to the one that works for you. And in the case of that client, they've decided they've made the choice to alter the system language and to provide different content to different audiences. So a lot of platforms will help you accommodate many languages. Even if you can't do all that, even if you can only feasibly do English, that's really all what you need for now. At the very least, you have to make sure that the software can identify whatever language you are using. And that's relatively simple technically in HTML tag in HTML, you can put the language there. And that way you can be sure at the very least that a user knows what language they're getting. And again, if you are using multiple languages, it's not just that you have to enable them. You have to think a lot about how different languages work, and some things you might take for granted in your language don't work that way. Big, the simplest example is length of words. If you have to accommodate, say, German as well as English, that's going to affect your design because you can't necessarily assume that a thing fits into a small space. Another good example is date and time. The way different languages and even different countries using the same language, say Brazil and Portugal, might express things slightly differently. They might format the time differently. The order of the time and the time zone of the date change. So you've got to make sure that when you're designing, you're thinking about that. And even like it affects even if you have a form, you've got to think about where the text and the labeling goes. Because if you get too wrapped up in, say, making your form input be part of a sentence, that sentence order may not be the same in another language. So you may be adding a complication there you'll have to sort out. So, and as often the answer to these things is keep it simple. Use a label and an input, and you're going to be in really good shape for everyone in a lot of ways. And finally, the other thing, if you have a language you're accommodating that is right to left instead of left to right, it's not just meant, I mean, to a degree, the browser will take care of that for you if it's told you have that, but then there are other things you're going to have to consider in your design and the way your design was built. So yes, lots to think about, but it makes it available to everyone, and it's a good thing to do. And that's what it all comes down to. We talked about there might be legal needs, there might be user demands, but in the end, the benefit of this is that your content reaches everyone. And that's a thing to shoot for. And it's not a thing we are necessarily at anyone who's using the web. So to cover it, to review, accessibility starts with design. And we don't just mean, the visuals and the actual, what your designer creates visually. It's also about the design of the content, making it understandable, making it consistently designed. That helps everybody, whatever their cognitive range, whatever their use case. Bring it, when you're trying to figure it out, bring it back to POUR: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And everything you need to do for accessibility is covered by one of those four things. The big thing is you can't assume everyone else is doing this right, because almost nobody is. There is an ongoing accessibility project that's run out of Utah State. Periodically, they assess a lot of homepages to see how they succeed or fail at accessibility. The most recent report, which is from this year, is that 97.4% of homepages have detectable failures according to the AA guidelines. That's actually down slightly from last year, but it's still really high. Everyone is not quite getting this. We all, even if we're trying, we all have a ways to go. And just to give you an idea, most of the failures are in 6 categories. A lot of them are about low contrast text. It's not super clear to everyone the visibility of a text against a background, for example, or a button against the background, or text against a button. They don't have alternative text on their images. They are missing labels for items in their forms. They actually have empty links and buttons, which means they put in buttons that don't have any text. They probably have an icon, like a share icon maybe, but they haven't provided a textual alternative. So anyone who can't see that icon doesn't know what that button does. That's counted in disability audits, as accessibility audits, as an empty link or button. Or quite simply, they're missing the doc language. And that's one of the very easiest things you can do in the code, is just make the page announce what language it's showing. So a lot of work for us all to do, but it's worth it, because if you're reaching everyone, you're reaching everyone. More people learn from you. More people look to you. It's good for business. It's good for everybody. So what next? Where do we go from here? future of accessibility, a lot of the future of accessibility is we've all just got to focus on it harder. We've all got to make it work. We've all got to do the things. And that's all, it's all doable now. Everything's in place. It's not necessarily, there are a lot of options, but they're not necessarily intricate. They're just something you have to think about. And as you think about it more and more, it gets easier and easier. And if you think about it from the beginning, from the design stage, from when you're creating content, it's better still. Other specific things to think about that you might not, we've talked about the learner, the user, and what they need and how they perceive and understand the content. You also have to think about the admin experience. Do you, the ADA very specifically is about provide reasonable accommodations to your employees. So if you have people who need to do admin work and they have, you know, different abilities that you need to think about, you need to make sure those are covered. There are other kinds of interaction we didn't really talk about that fall into the range of different abilities that I think are going to become more common, like speech interaction. You know, people have different speech issues. Normally, probably with your content, that doesn't come up, but as content becomes more vocally interactive, as technology advances and more we're letting users talk to the screen, like you know, using Siri or Google to talk, when that becomes more common and you're using it in your content, you'll need to be able, you need to know that you are accommodating those different speech abilities. And this is a really big one. Accessibility covers socioeconomic accessibility. If you just assume everyone has the best possible thing, you're probably leaving out people who are marginalized in some way. It could be that they have slow internet, and that might be about affordability of internet, or it might simply be about where they are. If they're in a rural area, they might not have fast internet, and there's nothing they can do about that. It covers older devices. Browsers can be very tricky, and we can't support everything forever, but you do need to account for that a little bit. And especially if they're using older devices, it's less about the browser and more about device. You know, it needs to work not just on the shiniest new iPhone, but also on iPhone 6, on recent iPhones that people haven't replaced yet. You've got to kind of keep that in mind. So, and that's a big one. And that kind of calls out the big thing about this. The biggest, there's legal, there's your clients and all, but the biggest reason to do all this is it's just the right thing to do. It should be available to everyone. It shouldn't be a siloed community. So it sounds like a lot to do, but it's good to do. It's educational for everyone involved, and it really, really is worth the effort if you start thinking about it from the very beginning. So I hope that's not too much to digest, and we definitely want to open up to questions.
Yes, bring us the questions. I have a few that have been sent to me like
Great.
Privately, so we can start there. But I just want to say thank you, Tim. It was really awesome. And I do want to address the accessibility. Tim mentioned it in passing, not in passing, he mentioned it during his presentation that this webinar wasn't exactly as accessible as we'd want it to be. We did not provide closed captioning. Which is something that would be a very simple thing to do that would make, not simple, but a very easy thing to do to make this webinar more accessible, which is exactly what we're talking about. Smaller things that you can do just to start. But the whole point with accessibility is the same thing. It's about being more inclusive. And Tim mentioned, don't assume everyone's doing it right. The reality is you have to try. By trying, you're doing something and you're trying to put a dent in it, and no one's going to get it perfect. No one is going to be perfectly inclusive, but by trying to include more people, you are doing the right thing. And that's just the beauty of it. So one of the questions, let me find where I had it. I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. Okay. And I did want to say, while I'm looking for it, we will be providing a transcript of this webinar. We also will, the recording will have closed captioning on it as well. And we will be providing the slides as well so that you can see those. Let me pull up the Q&A panel. And for some reason, it's not showing. There it is. Okay. So the first question that I have is regarding your point about avoiding jarring images and sudden animations. Mm-hmm. Would you also advise against using animations in PowerPoint slides?
Not necessarily. It's about whether they're jarring. A smooth, gradual, slow animation is fine, I would think. This is not to rule out animation. Animation is valuable and can be helpful. It can help clarify things. So you don't want to throw away animation. Just don't make it sudden. Don't make it, unexpected. I think there are probably, people who have seen PowerPoint slides a lot. They know there's going to be motion. They know there's going to be
Mhm.
transition. So as long as they're, expected, reasonably expected and smooth and not jarring, it would be fine, I think. Yeah.
Another question I have is about specific colors when it comes, you mentioned about like poor design and better
Yeah.
design when we're dealing with colors and color combinations. Are there specific combinations that we should absolutely stay away from?
No, not necessarily. There is a great tool available. We'll have to send, I think we're going to send some links out after this, and I'll try to remember to add this one to it. There's a great tool that helps tell you how good or bad your color contrast is. That's what's important. It's not so much the color itself, it's about how the color relates to whatever it's against. And what does and doesn't work is going to be surprising. You might think blue on white, you're fine. No, not necessarily. If it's a light blue, it will not read well. Reds tend to work as gray for some people, so that may affect it. But this tool is really helpful at, they measure it as a ratio somehow, like the contrast ratio, and that needs to be really strong. I mentioned there are A and AA and AAA guidelines. The expectations for those are different and more strict as you go up. So, and it also, it's not just two colors against each other, it's the size of what it is. Like you need a higher ratio contrast for small text than you do for large text. So I'll try to remember to add that link to our list we're sending out. And then you can also just search like web color contrast, and you'll probably land on this tool first because everyone uses it. It's super easy to use and super smart and very helpful.
Mhm. I've heard also a rule of thumb is if you don't have a visual impairment or a need for more accessible visual content
Mhm.
and you have a hard time seeing it, it's safe to assume that
Yeah.
someone who does have an issue with seeing things as easily as someone without an impairment, that you probably shouldn't do it. So if reading red on white, red and black, I
Yeah.
know is definitely a bad idea. And then again, just using color to dictate information or to signal. There's an example about like a login page when you have someone filling in their login or their first name or filling out a form, and they highlight the boxes that are correct in green and highlight the ones that are wrong in yellow. I mean,
Oh,
in red, those
yeah.
colors to someone with color blindness look exactly the same. So they're not able to see that something is
Yes.
wrong. So adding small icons with X's or adding alternate text at the bottom saying this particular line item needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And also, besides color though, just think about people with less good vision than you. I feel like even if your vision is excellent, bring in someone to look at it whose isn't. My eyes aren't great. I struggle with smaller text. Dark mode, super trendy, everyone wants it. It's good in a lot of ways. I have a little trouble reading at something. Then you really got to make sure if you're putting white against black, you got to make sure that's clear and visible to everybody. So there's lots
exactly.
to think about, but there are definitely, yes, tools on the internet that will help you specifically with color contrast.
Awesome. And Mel actually just dropped a tool for Chrome that it came
Oh,
out
cool.
that is it uses using it design tools prior to this. Awesome.
And a lot of
Um,
that's a good point. A lot of browsers, there are extensions available, and also increasingly, just baked into the browser. You can actually look at the page the way a colorblind person would see it. There are a lot of great tools to help with that.
so our next question is how does Exceed and Evolve so Exceed is the name for the Intellum platform. They both we those terms have been used commonly interchangeably, and Evolve, which is our content authoring tool. So those two things, how do they help with accessibility compared to other learning authoring tools like Articulate Storyline?
Hmm. Um, I don't know. I can't speak to the other tools specifically. I know what we're doing is we've done multiple accessibility audits of the learner view of our experience, and we've been certified as meeting the AA requirement. We're going to continue to get re-audited as we introduce new features and change things to make sure we're still meeting those guidelines. And I don't know that Evolve has been audited, but Evolve even earlier than Exceed, Evolve has kept a strong eye on accessibility. They make it a priority in the tutorials for Evolve. It's called out what you need to do, make sure you provide alternative text for images and such. So we feel like we're doing it well. We're working on it hard. We're going to keep working on it more. Yeah, I don't know. Chi, can you speak to what your knowledge is of other?
Sure, absolutely. Again, I think I mentioned it a little bit, like no one's doing it perfectly. By no means is Intellum doing it perfectly, but we do try our very best to make sure that our platform is as accessible as possible and allows that the people using it to deliver content and educational content and programs, that you can do that in an accessible way with an effective and accessible way. Again, I'm on the marketing team, so I'm not in the trenches making and delivering content and helping clients holding hands and helping them deliver that way. So I can't compare it to Articulate. Helen is actually on the call, who is she works way more with Evolve, and she hosts webinars about Evolve as well. So she can speak about content authoring. And our next webinar is actually on content authoring. So that's a really great, actually, thank you for that segue, Jordan, because we will probably dive into that as well, into content authoring as a whole and how it compares to other platforms and other tools, because one, we just love Evolve. It's amazing. Everyone loves it. But yeah, so I can't speak to its accessibility in comparison, but I do know that the Intellum platform and Evolve is more accessible, and is doing a great job at trying to be more accessible, and it is a constant thing that we're looking at. So the next question, I hope that answered your question, Jordan. The next question is for Evolve specifically. Do you have guidance on how to implement ARIA labels for accessibility? And Tim, if you can't answer that one, I can give Helen the ability to chat.
Oh, that'd be great. She can definitely answer better than I can. So
okay, Helen, I'm glad you're here for this one. I'm going to give you permission to talk if you want to go ahead and unmute your mic.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes. We sure can.
Fantastic. Sorry, there's dinner being made in the background, so apologies for any banging. But yeah, I was just typing up there that we've got some real focus on accessibility in Evolve. A lot of the components are WCAG compliant already, and can be made to be your courses can be made accessible with good focus on your content planning how your content is going to fit into the components. We're going to have a webinar specifically in August for accessibility to do with Evolve. So following your wonderful webinar today, we're going to be focusing exactly on that issue with Evolve. So keep an eye out for that on the Intellum site. Yeah. And sorry, what was the second question about? Was that about?
It was about how to implement ARIA labels for accessibility.
Yes, so we do have, there is a knowledge-based guide on that, which is publicly accessible. So I will find a link to that right now, and I will pop it into the chat for everybody.
Thank you.
Helen, I suspect that a lot of the tools within Evolve where ARIA labels are really important, such as, I forget the names of things, the like tabs and such, where ARIA labels are really important. I feel quite comfortable that that's baked in, that if you select that tool, then you're going to get the ARIA labeling you need and such. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. As you're going through and putting in all content in all of our components, there are the ARIA label section is very visible, so you can, and the alt text one as well, so you can pop in both of those as you go through, just as part of your build for that component. So you don't have to hunt for it, you don't have to sort of add it in a strange way. It's open and ready for you to add those things. And yeah, also we've got a whole section on our knowledge base about accessibility, which gives you guidance as well as how to do things. So yeah, it's all there.
Thank you, Helen. You're the best.
Just as an extra thing, I was thinking if you find that something needs an alternative form for your accessibility guidelines, so you can always provide an alternative version of a component. So say your sort of infographic, something a bit special, was a little too complex for accessibility guidelines, then you can have a simple button using logic in Evolve where you can switch to a completely accessible version that's a lot more simplified and suitable for the audience. So we've got plenty of options in there for using accessible content.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And that actually leads a great segue to the next question. It's about content. So when we're winding back to when you were talking about language, one of the questions where, and you kind of mentioned it, so I would love for an expansion if you could.
Okay.
It's that the platform itself, the Intellum platform, is out of the box 32 languages that it can translate to, but the content itself, it has to be created. And so the question is, does the content also translate with the languages, with those 32 languages?
Not automatically. We have to, we use translation services to help with that. I'm not sure of the specifics of how that works per client necessarily, but that's something that has to be done, and we have systems in place for different clients to kind of make that an automatic process that when new content is added, it's sent out for translation. But that definitely varies per client as far as I know. It's not so if you enable another language in Intellum, that just handles the common text, the labels, the headers, footers, that sort of thing. The specific content, the content about a particular thing, that would still need to be translated. But we work with the client very well to help make that happen when they need it.
Awesome. So those are all of the questions that we have so far. If anyone has any more, we'd love for you to drop them in the Q&A, but we won't keep you for, we give you 15 minutes back if you have it. Tim,
I'm going to steal a couple more because I thought of something I wanted to talk about more.
Yes,
that
please do.
I feel like I kind of overlooked is a big part of accessibility. We talked about it's different devices, the way people use the internet, mobile. I guarantee you need to think about the mobile experience more than you are. And that's about that, how does your layout, what happens to it when you put it on a tiny vertical phone instead of a big, giant horizontal desktop screen?
Is it responsive?
Is it responsive? Exactly. And beyond that, though, is it loading fast enough? Is there too much? You're more likely to have slower speed on mobile than you are on a desktop.
And when that applies to like customer education, like if you've got assessments within your program, again, linking back to this, something that I thought about was when you were talking about the socioeconomic limitations. If you've got times, like if your assessment is timed and you haven't factored in the loading time and the fact that someone's internet speed is going to be slower, if that timing doesn't factor that in, then you could possibly, my intern is contributing to this part, then that could contribute to like them not passing that assessment. And if it is a certification exam, then then that person is at a disadvantage. So those are other things to think about when we're talking about how it applies to an education program as well.
Yeah. And thinking about mobile just goes back to a great way to learn about all this and to understand it better is just try something else. Like, don't always look at your site on desktop. Go look at it on a mobile and see how it's doing. Find those tools where you can look at the website as, for particular cases of color blindness. If you're working on a Mac, try out VoiceOver, which is the Mac speech reading client. It's not, it does some things differently than some of the older, more used screen readers, but it'll tell you what the experience is like. And if you've never experienced it, it's really unusual. And it kind of gives you an idea of what people who depend on screen readers have to work with and what they need and how they use it. So just try that from time to time and see what it's like for other people, with people who have different experiences than you, and you'll learn a lot and it'll be interesting and fun.
If you're inclusive in your production process, you'll be inclusive in your delivery process. Ooh, that should be like a proverb, a tech proverb. So I think we've reached time. I thank you so much, Tim, for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and share our final slide just so you guys can see what I'm saying. Let me present this. I can get my screen to go correctly. And desktop 2. All right. So Thank you guys so much for being with us today. Again, my name is Chi Johnson. We would love for your action items to be to follow us on LinkedIn, explore the public experience. It is what you're in right now. This is our platform. So you can tinker around and see exactly what you can do with education is how it's phenomenal, it's robust, it's flexible. But also we want you to check out the WCAG guidelines on accessibility and to follow Tim on, I say follow Tim on LinkedIn, but he's not really on LinkedIn. So just follow me and I'll give you all the things.
I'll look in from time to time, but there's not much to follow for me.
Right.
Sorry.
So mostly follow us on LinkedIn, but also I want to make sure that you know of the takeaways you're going to get. We're going to be sending out a PDF on Monday with our recap. So we'll be sending out the recording of this, the transcript of this webinar. We'll be sending out a PDF of the POUR guidelines so that you can see those and have those handy for you as you're designing and developing your program. And then we also want you to go ahead and register for next month's webinar. Underscore is covering the importance of effective content authoring and simulations. And Evolve, Helen spoke on Evolve. She popped in and she's dropped some links in there for you to know about the accessibility event that Evolve is having in August as well. And then a couple links for resources in there. But one of the biggest resources that we'll be sending out is we have a course within the public experience about accessibility. So it is a learning path that you can travel through and understand how accessibility from that level that Tim has done some really great work on. But we just want to thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you at our next Underscore webinar.
Okay. All right.
Bye, everyone.